just want to raise a question on law reform. As we know, Chinese society has been deeply divided and lack of consensus almost on every issue. But only except one is the judicial justice. And more people, Chinese people, realize its importance. And including the party officials. They learned it from the Wang Lijun and Bo Xilai's incidents last year. So everybody knows if there is no judicial justice, nobody is safe in China. My question is that because the current situation is not that optimistic, there are a very bad sign, people disappointed. My question is that in the current system, is there any room to move forward the law reform and gradually build up a rule of law? If so, what is the point to break through? If not, where is Chinese people's hope in the future? What should international community do? Thanks.
Jerry, before you or Professor Fu answer, it's a very good question, and I want to just add one wrinkle to it. Jerry described the proliferation of lawyers and law schools in China over the last 20, 25 years. Yet it is a system that is still run by the political party and political forces. And you don't have still, and Jerry a year ago sat down and told me, you know, which government officials, like the Minister of Justice, aren't lawyers, which judges aren't lawyers. Our system is crawling with lawyers, even in places where they probably don't belong. But we link law and policy almost organically. So there's a sense of a legal framework around the way we make policy decisions. What's the pathway for China to move from a political party-driven system in the direction of a system where lawyers and legal standards and legal approaches begin to have a bigger role, both in the implementation of the law, but also in a broader sense in deciding policy? It seems to me that evolution is a big piece of what needs to happen.
Well, that's what we do, I guess. You know, reform the political system through rule of law, piecemeal, gradual change of society, using law to tame and regulate the political power. How likely it is? Well, there are good signs. If you look at the most active forces in Chinese society, at least half of them are lawyers, number-wise. They are the lawyers who study law in different ways, some of them from the grassroots forces, others from elite law schools. They're participating in this quite a grand political legal movement. But that, the demand side is very clear from civil society that there got to be more regularity, rule of law, to constrain the arbitrary state power. And that is really what rule of law is about, is to contain the arbitrary state power. That is somehow that is happening, has happened in the past 30 years. So what is new changes is, can those demand drive political change within the system? So that we come back to the you need politics. I mean, you need legally trained people in the high office to make law relevant. If going back to the first generation of communist leaders, there were lots of lawyers. The first Chief Justice in China was a Japan-trained lawyer. The second one was also a Japan-trained lawyer. It's only after the 50s, in the 60s, 70s, you had whatever we know about China, but that was not China even in the 50s. So I think Prime Minister is now a lawyer. The Chief Justice is a lawyer. I think within this 200 some party Congress, I think people say there are about a dozen, legally trained lawyers. So next generation number may increase to 30. Next generation maybe 50. So that probably would matter. I think it's significant. That's the default position. When you have crisis and you don't know what to do, you think about law, right? The former minister would think about he's an engineer. Okay, what the engineers would do. Before that, you never went to university. So I think that is the background. I think it would take time, but I think you are building the forces there in the institution and also outside the institutions.
I think law is improving in China, if you mean legislation. Laws are getting better, but they're products of compromise. Some of the compromises are unattractive, but by and large, the legislation is getting better. But the problem is the implementation and who does the interpreting and application, and there's a struggle for power. Within the government, how to allocate power, the courts relative to the prosecutors, relative to the police and administration. The relation of government to the party is one of the fundamental questions that now is being re-examined. I mentioned earlier the head of the party political legal commission has been demoted to ordinary Politburo membership, not to the standing committee. But then the question becomes, what is the scope of power of the political legal commission? Are they going to be able to continue to decide concrete cases? Will their subordinate counterparts at every level of government, every level has political legal commission. If you talk to my blind friend Chen Guangcheng, he keeps emphasizing that in his experience, in his county, in his city, the political legal committee was everything. Well, that's changing too. There's a struggle within the party. Should the local political legal committee continue to dictate important court decisions? And who should control that committee? Traditionally, it's been the local police chief who had control over the committee, even though the court chief and the prosecution chief and the justice chief have equal government rank. The police chief usually had a higher party rank. And if he's no longer going to control that committee, is it going to be the deputy secretary of the city party committee that's over it? So there's a lot of structural problems coming up and problems about the scope of authority of these political legal committees. Are they going to control the ideology of the legal system, the policies of the legal system? And to what extent, if they don't, will other party leaders, just through their own interference personally, whether at the local level or at the higher level? And it isn't just the party, although all this has to be worked out. People say, oh, the party only interferes in sensitive cases. Well, who is the party? If a local official calls up the head of the court and says, look, you must let this case be won by the defendant, is it the party? Because he has a party hat. He's also a government official. He also may represent a local industry that's the defendant in the case. Or it may be his cousin that's involved. Maybe a friend who went to high school with him. I think the most difficult factor, more difficult than corruption that permeates the courts, I think the most difficult factor is guanxi. Now, I know some people in the United States say we shouldn't emphasize guanxi. Every society operates through social networks. But in China, it has a special meaning. I mean, if I'm a lawyer and I'm friendly with an American judge, we generally know what the limits are, what we can talk about and what we can't, and what we should do. There are, of course, there are exceptions. We are struggling with these. But in China, it's out of control, just the way corruption is out of control. And I think the biggest obstacle to reform relating to the law, human rights, and other matters is really the fact that the machine, the party machine now, is increasingly corrupt. It's increasingly a way that those who have the power want to keep it. And it's a way to make money. Some people even say it's a kind of gangster regime. I wouldn't go that far, although there's certainly emanations of gangsterism in some things that occur. So it's not just, in other words, what we would all recognize as political. It overlaps with corruption, guanxi, local protectionism, and a lot of things. So this is a tough system to crack.
We promised to get you out of here at 3:30. I'm just going to offer one last word, in some ways summarizing, but some ways looking forward. Jerry mentioned earlier that there is an agenda of things that perhaps are part of the future discussion of human rights that haven't been so much at the center. And I know our own experience. I did 3 human rights dialogues with the Chinese. We did 2 legal experts dialogues. Ira and Jerry came to those. One of the things we did was to say we're going to operate on 2 tracks. We're going to look at what I would call a traditional agenda. We're going to look at political prisoner cases. We're going to talk about religious freedom. We're going to talk about Tibet and the situation with the Uyghurs. But we're also going to have a kind of contemporary discussion which is reflective of what Chinese are saying to each other. So I would go into those meetings and I would have somebody on my staff look at Weibo, look at the Chinese social media that morning. And I would add to the agenda the case of the labor dispute, the strike that was going on, dispute over wages, over working conditions or hours. We'd look at internet freedom issues, the lack of access to information. We'd look at the environmental issues or food safety, or we'd look at these issues of abuse of power by local authorities and the arbitrariness of the system. It seems to me that as we think about both the challenges but also the opportunities, for people here and elsewhere who are trying to figure out what is it we can do, the mantra ought to be, how do we identify those things that Chinese people are now vigorously debating within their own society? How do we amplify their voices? How do we give them international connections? And how do we reinforce the extent to which a rule-based, a law-based system will help China, both government and Chinese people, arbitrate and resolve those differences? I'm quite optimistic about China, actually. In my conversations with the government officials, you know, they wanted to say, who are you to raise these issues? And they'd say, oh, you're only talking about 100 Chinese? No, you look at the social media and you recognize this is a country absolutely in change, where there's a huge amount of social churn. And I think for us to be opportunistic and to look at those areas that are affecting tens or hundreds of millions of Chinese people and try to reinforce those elements within the society, and there are many that want to see a more rights-respecting, rule-based system in the future.
Well, that's a wonderful agenda. I'm delighted that Mike finally abandoned the role of moderator. I thought he was going to...
I couldn't keep my mouth shut.
I always use it to talk as much as possible, and I was admiring your self-restraint. I would only say one thing we should add and maybe end on a good note. For over 20 years, we were separated from China, 1950 to 71, 2. And one of the questions some of us had in that period was, had communism destroyed the traditional great Chinese sense of humor? And lo and behold, what we found when contact was resumed, not only had it not destroyed the sense of humor, but it had provided a huge amount of new material for the Chinese to work on. And one of the pleasures of doing what Mike suggests, looking at the internet, looking at the comments on things, they are wonderfully funny. The people who write in are so perceptive. They're so clever. And it really adds a note of humor that can expand our own consciousness.
On that note, I want to thank our panelists and thank you all for being here.